How's it going, guys? Randall aka Shizukatz here on the Tressa's Collectibles channel. Today we're going to be looking at the Mushoku Tensei deck I played at the San Gabriel Springfest Trios, going 8-0 undefeated for personal record, and ultimately finishing at top 8. Before I begin, I also have to give huge props to both of my teammates, Mike and Kobe. We had an amazing run, being the only undefeated team in Swiss rounds with a 7-0 team score, and a total score of 18-3 between all of us combined. It's unfortunate that we couldn't get further than top 8, but it was an insane day nonetheless. I also want to give one more shout out to Ankit, a player from my local area who was in the 3rd place team Set Sail using 8 Standby Mushoku. They're also the team that knocked us out of top 8. Ankit's one of the most well-known Mushoku players amongst our playgroup, and we've iterated on Mushoku lists a lot in the past. I'll be making a couple comparisons between our lists here and there. Alright, let's talk about the deck. I chose to play 5 Standby, 3 Goldbar Mushoku Tensei for this event. This is a deck that I've already played a decent amount of in Japanese, so I'm very familiar with how the deck wants to operate, and I would definitely consider it a comfort pick. I also felt that because the format was trios, I was significantly less likely to run into what I would consider to be bad matchups, and I feel that Standby Mushoku's strong early game could lead to lots of easy wins in a lot of general matchups. Let's begin by talking about the choice restriction. Between Ghislaine and Rudy, I feel that Rudy is a very weak choice in the current metagame. It relies on holding all 3 lanes on the board in order to be most effective, and many of the popular decks right now either have ways to remove lanes, such as Watame or Gil Thunder, or have strong enough defensive boards that I can't expect to have all of my lanes on the board on defense, such as Kanata builds of Hololive, or Quince if they can develop strong level 3 buffers fast enough. On the flip side, Ghislaine promotes my strategy of maintaining Eris Lv1s throughout my early game, as 8500 power is more than enough to overpower many popular decks level 1 lineups. I decided to go with a full 4 copies of Ghislaine, rather than playing a split of Ghislaine and Eris Hand Encore, with an emphasis on getting Ghislaine as consistently as possible. To replace the Rudy counter, I played the Sylph event, Mushoku's other defensive option. This event can serve as a 4k counter, or I can discard a second copy from my hand to turn it into an anti-damage counter instead. The 4k counter mode was extremely relevant in many matchups throughout the tournament, and while I never actually got to use the anti-damage mode, it's hypothetically an extremely strong option against Escanor, being able to negate an entire set of ping 1s, whereas Rudy Rest Counter would be completely useless as soon as they put a Gil Thunder Bouncer on the board. However, being a replacement for Rudy Counter wasn't the only reason I decided to include Sylph Event in my list. It also goes hand in hand with Ruijerd, my top end of choice. The Ruijerd top end consists of 2 parts, the early play healer and the Mocha Climax Combo. The healer can be early played if I have the Rudy runner in my clock, and on play he heals from the bottom of the clock. This means that I can clock Rudy from my hand and play Ruijerd without immediately losing the early play condition. At the start of my Climax phase, I can activate his change ability, bouncing himself back to hand as cost, to place up to 1 Climax Combo Ruijerd from my hand. It's important to note that you don't need a combo Ruijerd in hand in order to activate the change. You can simply bounce the healer back to your hand to use again later. Also, even if you do have the target in hand, you do not have to place it on stage, because the change text says choose up to 1. The general strategy with this deck is to dominate the level 1 game with Eris and Ghislaine, so that I can freely loop Ruijerd heals throughout the level 2 game by playing him to my back row and then just bouncing him back to my hand. Additionally, if I draw or trigger a standby at level 2, bouncing the Ruijerd back to my hand frees up a slot on board for me to place new characters with that standby effect. If I'm against a deck that can present strong boards at level 2, I also have the option to change Ruijerd into the Climax Combo level 3. On play from hand, all of my opponent's characters lose 1000 power times their own level until the end of the turn, so opposing level 3s will lose 3000 power, making them much easier to contest. The Climax Combo is very simple. On attack, look at the top 2 cards of the opponent's deck, send any of them to waiting room, and leave the rest on top of their deck in any order. Then I do the same to myself. This allows me to remove any climaxes from the top 2 of their deck to more easily stick damage, while also giving myself the ability to trigger precisely or move my own climax further down in the deck so that I can use it to cancel on their next turn. My attack order when using Ruijerd depends on whether I want to use him offensively or defensively. Typically in the mid game, if I change into Ruijerd with the early play, I will try to use his combo defensively, moving climaxes in my own deck so that I can cancel, and this requires attacking with Ruijerd last. However, if I'm going for the kill, I will attack with Ruijerd first so that I can influence triggers on my later attacks. Sometimes, I will also need to play around anti-change mechanics, in which case I attack out of order, but for the most part, I follow these rules when I can. One thing I noticed about 8 standby Mushoku decks is that they don't really do a whole lot during the level 2 game. Some decks will include a Rudy early play healer or an Eris early play burner, but apart from that, they mostly just trigger standbys, build a board with cards like Paul, and chill till it's time to use Gallane combo. While that style of play has proved to be effective, I felt that Ruijerd allows me to play the level 2 game in a much more proactive way, addressing threats, sometimes using Climax combo at level 2, and forcing my opponent into a tight endgame spot. Ankit chose to run Ruijerd in his list as well, with 3 copies of the healer and 2 copies of the combo, although he only ran the Climax combo Ruijerd for the minus power effect, since he was using 8 standby climaxes and no gold bars. As for the level 1 combo, I'm just playing the standard Eris combo that's used in every Mushoku standby deck. She's always 7500 power, as long as my opponent isn't using any effects that remove traits, and her Climax combo lets me mill through the deck, gain advantage, and put extra standby targets into the waiting room all at the same time. She's definitely one of my favorite level 1 combos in the entire game, being a very simple card, but insanely strong, usually netting me tons of advantage through a combination of surviving combat and her advantage combo. As for the Climax lineup, instead of going for a 4-4 lineup, I decided on going 5-3 with 1 extra standby. This is because I feel that getting an Eris and Gallane combination consistently at level 1 is extremely important, even if the standby being used to bring out Gallane was not the correct one for the combo. Against a lot of decks, just having 8500 bodies on the board is more than they can handle, so I can at least retain the board and then go from there. Goldbar for Ruijerd can be added to the hand fairly easily simply due to the nature of Goldbar, in addition to the twin drive that the deck has access to, so I felt 3 copies was good. Going with a 6-2 line probably works fine as well. Okay, now let's get into the rest of the list. Starting at level 0, I ran 4 copies of the Rudy Runner. This is Mushoku Tensei's best turn 1 play, being a 3500 center runner, and you'd normally include this card in Mushoku decks anyway, but in this deck, he also serves as the early play condition for the Ruijerd Lv3, making him even more important than usual. Alongside Rudy, I ran 2 copies of this level 0 Eris, which is probably a card that many of you have never seen before. She's very similar to the John I played in anti-meta AOT at Anaheim, with the ability to kill an opponent's front row level 0 when she reverses a battle opponent. The only difference between the two is that she doesn't require another character on stage to use that effect, and as a result has 500 less base power. 3000 was still a perfectly fine power level, and the effect can theoretically be used to deny certain effects, such as ones that require sending the character to memory or clock as part of cost, and can also be used to allow Eris to get a 2-for-1 in case I don't have enough characters to efficiently answer the opponent's board. Or she can even just be used to open up lanes to get in some more damage. Most importantly, the card is red that can be readily sent to level zone, since we have a lot less red than normal due to not running any red level 3s like 8 standby Mushoku would typically run. Next are the 3 copies of Ruijerd level 0. On play, I can clock a card from hand to search my deck for any character. This is a great card to search for Eris combo, since Eris requires stock to be put into play, and Ruijerd's search effect requires no stock cost. I can also use him to grab specific tech cards that will be useful in the matchup, such as the Lilia level 0. Sometimes this clock can also be used to boost myself up to the next level, similar to how a Riki effect would. Additionally, it can be used to color fix by clocking a card of a specific color in my hand, and Ruijerd himself is the best color fix for green. Next are 2 copies of the Eris Fukujiro. Similar to the Eris 3k attacker, these are included in the deck because I wanted more red, but I also wanted to have access to a costless discard outlet. Being able to grab Sylph events off the Fukujiro is really powerful as well, since it can grab any level 1 or higher card, not just characters. One of the most powerful cards in this list was definitely the Lilia level 0. She can rest herself to give one of my characters on reverse stock kick, providing crucial hard removal against encore based decks like Standby Quince, or powerful on death abilities like Hololive's Aqua, LaPlus, and Akirose. Additionally, if the matchup is going poorly for the opponent, you're dominating the board and they're running out of cards, typically their best way out would be to 3-stock Encore a big beat stick and try to push for lethal damage. However, by stock kicking their best attackers, you can completely lock opponents out of the game. However, Lilia's second ability is what makes her truly shine in this deck. Rest herself and discard any event to salvage a character from the waiting room. Having the flexibility to use Sylph events in this way to solidify my game plan is extremely powerful, and was a huge part in making sure everything was running smoothly throughout all my games. In my opinion, running at least one Lilia is mandatory, but I settled on 2 to allow me to see her more consistently without having to search her out through cards like Ruijerd. For other back row, I ran 3 Roxy Brainstorms and 1 Guild Receptionist Spammable Brainstorm. In my opinion, Roxy Brainstorm is the single most powerful card in Mushoku Tensei, and is part of the set's core identity. Having such easy access to Twin Drive just by playing a Climax is extremely powerful, on top of being a salvage Brainstorm. Utilizing the Twin Drive to pay out Climaxes on the fly is always appreciated, but sometimes you want to Twin Drive aggressively for extra damage, or to try to solidify your lead on the board by triggering an additional standby and bringing out a buffer such as a 2-2 Ghislaine or 3-2 Roxy. At level 3, the Twin Drive ability has interesting synergy with Ruijerd's Mocha combo since I top check 2 cards from my own deck. I can look at those 2 cards first before I decide on whether or not I want to Twin Drive. The Guild Receptionist Brainstorm has 2 equally important effects. The first is on play. If I have 2 or more other characters, I can draw 1, discard 1, a great way to filter unneeded cards out of hand, such as additional Ghislaine 2/2s. The Spammable Brainstorm searches 1 card from the deck, then discards 1 card for each Climax hit. I mostly used this just as a small deck adjustment rather than spamming the Brainstorm over and over, and throughout the day I never ran into a situation where I needed to panic button my way out of a terrible deck state. Lastly, I ran 1 copy of the Rudy Bounce Back buffer and 1 Roxy Climax swap. Rudy gives 1k on play, and when I play a Climax, he can bounce himself back to hand to give another 1k and rearrange the top 2 cards of my deck as I please. This card is obviously very strong in standby, offering free power and trigger knowledge while simultaneously clearing up a zone to play a standby target into. Roxy Climax swap is another pretty easy inclusion, just because she's a Climax swap. But funnily enough, I think I used her more for the on-play 1500 buff than for her Climax swap ability. Level 1 and Level 2 are both very simple lineups. I only chose to play the 4 Eris and 4 Ghislaine as my on-board options, with 1 copy of the Roxy 2k counter for a touch of extra defense. I played Roxy over the Ruijerd Lv1 counter since I didn't want to risk Lv1 counter getting screwed over by top checking a Sylph event, and I went for the more simple approach instead. Between the Roxy and the 4 Sylphs, I had a lot of defensive strength that I could use to mess up the opponent's plan as they swung into my board. At level 3, alongside the 3 copies of Ruijerd Healer and Ruijerd Combo, I played 1 copy of the Trial Deck Roxy. She has on-play heal and on-attack pay 2, ditch 2, burn 2, adding an extra finishing element to the deck. It made a lot of sense to me to include her in the list since she offered healing, while also utilizing the stock and hand that the Ruijerd combo does not use. That being said, I used her a grand total of 0 times throughout the day. I would still keep her in the list regardless. The Roxy back row is a staple of Mushoku standby decks. She gives 2k power to characters in front of her, has on-play draw 2 discard 1, which can be useful for digging for cards like Sylph Counter or Climaxes, and has a third effect that grants 1k and Twin Drive to any of my characters whenever I trigger a Climax. She also has the same synergy with Ruijerd's Mocha combo as the Roxy Brainstorm, since she can grant Twin Drive while Ruijerd looks at both of his potential triggers with the Climax combo. While she's typically brought into play at level 2 via a standby, I also played her from hand a few times, so it's important to keep an eye out for blue to send to level when going to level 3. In Ankit's list, he chose to play just 1 copy of this Roxy, alongside 2 copies of Paul level 3. However, front row globals like Paul are susceptible to removal, such as the earlier mentioned Watame and Gil Thunder, and I also have 3 fewer standbys in my deck, which makes it less viable to bring out Paul via standby trigger during the attack phase, which is the ideal time to bring him out. As a result of these factors, I chose not to run him at all, and instead just went with 2 Roxys. Finally, I played 1 Sylphiette stock swap. Usually in 8 standby, this isn't the easiest inclusion, as players will often prioritize red and blue, and the third color can go either way between yellow or green. However, in this deck, with green as one of our main colors, this was an easy card for me to include in the list. I only played it 1 time throughout the day, but it absolutely won me that game in the most disgusting way possible. Alright, I think I've talked about most of the game plan of the deck at this point, but let's go over it one more time. At level 1, your goal is to field at least 2 copies of Eris combo, followed by Climax combo to bring out Ghislaine. So in order to play both Eris, you will want to have at least 2 stock going into level 1. If you draw extra copies of Standby, consider discarding an Eris and standbying her out at level 0 in order to save yourself some resources and lessen incoming damage as well if you can safely standby her out to the front row. Ideally, at level 1, you can use the Eris and Ghislaine combination to dominate the board and maintain hand size as you transition to level 2. With the Eris combo, I prioritize grabbing at least one Rudy runner to clock for the Ruijerd early play condition, as well as the Ruijerds themselves. If the matchup calls for it, I'll also look for the Roxy counter to defend my board and maintain control. Other than that, I can also use Eris combo to look for other key utility pieces that I'm missing, such as the Roxy Brainstorm or the Lilia level 0. Going into level 2, you want to think about what your opponent can put on the board, how many lanes they can contest, and what measures you can take to foil their plan. Here's a few example matchups with some insight on what my goals are in each of those particular matchups. Against 7 Deadly Sins, I know their 2-1 Meliodas combo and Lost Vein Meliodas can't do anything to contest my board of 1-1 Eris backed up by Ghislaine, so I clock Rudy to turn on my early plays, play them, and then bounce them back every turn to loop them, and then stop clocking to stay as far out of Escanor lethal range as possible. Ideally, I also want to play or trigger a standby to fill the empty back row slots so that Ghislaine doesn't drop to 7k power. Against Kanata Marine, I can't lose against their level 1 board, which is just Miko 6ks, but I also know I won't be able to contest Kanatas attacking into them at level 2, since they will constantly have a ton of counters in their hand, and I can't use Ruijerd to contest if they salvage Suisei anti-change counter. My plan here is to hoard Sylph counters so that I can kill Kanatas when they swing in. Eris and Ghislaine should be at least 12k after Sylph counter, which can clear their Kanatas off the board. Against Quince, I want to prioritize Lilia so that I can kick 2-2 Ninos off the board. Their 1-1s can't do a whole lot to Eris and Ghislaine, but the 2-2s will usually murder whatever's in front of them, so as long as I can keep those 2-2s in check, I should be able to keep the mid game fairly even. If they're attacking you with a Nino 2-2 that was not brought out via combo, you can actually use a Sylph counter on defense to boost an Eris or Ghislaine to at least 12,500, just out of range of the Nino's 12k. Prioritizing a second Ghislaine helps hedge against their level 0 bounceback Nino, which can give an extra 1k offensive power. At level 3, I don't really have a distinct board that I go for every single game, and I basically just treat the level 2 game as an early level 3 game, since I already have access to my finisher combo and can use Standby to bring out even more late game cards. As far as my leveling game plan goes, you always want red and green for your first 2 levels. This allows you to play your most important colors, and then clock the Rudy runner at level 2 to activate the Ruijerd early play. The most ideal leveling target for red is the 3k Eris level 0, followed by Eris Fukujiro. As mentioned earlier, the best leveling target for green is the level 0 Ruijerd, followed by the early play healer Ruijerd. Because my plan is to spam the same copy over and over again, I don't actually need too many copies of the card in my hand, and can play the game pretty well with just 2. At level 3, I want to level blue in case I have to hardplay the TD Roxy or Assist Roxy. At this point, just level whatever blue card you can, as the game will end pretty soon. Decks that I perceive as harder matchups are the ones that can readily contest my level 1 board, whether in part or in full. Nino 2-2s come to mind, and are a big reason to play 2 Lilia in my opinion, as she allows you to readily answer the 2-2. Danmachi is also a bit rough, since Bell's naturally high power, compounded by Pyonkichi, can clear your entire board in one fell swoop. However, in that matchup, I try to hold Sylph counters to use for the anti-damage effect, since it can be devastating when used against a Hestia stacked with a bunch of cancel burns. Alright, I've been going on for a while, but I think that pretty much sums up everything I wanted to go over today. To close out this video, I want to also give one last big shout out to Jeffrey, Raymond, and Cody of Honest Weiss Schwarz, who were the team that won BSF San Gabriel. At this point, all 3 members of the team have actually been featured as guests on the Tressa's Collectibles channel, so I'll leave links to those videos in the description so you can check those out, as well as the link to their YouTube channel. Big congrats to them once again. This has been Randall, aka Shizukatz, on the Tressa's Collectibles channel, and until next time, see ya!